The first time I heard there had been another will, I was sitting at a polished conference table, with my hands folded so tightly in my lap that my knuckles hurt. I had gone into that office expecting grief, paperwork, and the dull cruelty of hearing my adoptive parents reduced to bank accounts, signatures, and legal clauses. My name is Simone Beaumont. I was not expecting the estate attorney to look down at his notes, clear his throat, and mention an earlier version of the will that had included my biological brother and sister by name. He said it casually at first, like he was only explaining the history of the documents. The final will, the one my adoptive parents had signed 2 weeks before they died in a car accident, left everything to me. The earlier will, drafted years before, had set aside meaningful provisions for my biological siblings, Lena and Marcus, even though my parents had never formally adopted them. Then the attorney paused, because he must have seen my face change. I remember asking, "What earlier will?" He looked uncomfortable then. He adjusted his glasses and said, "It appears there was a prior estate plan with broader family provisions. That version was superseded by the final will." Superseded. Such a clean legal word for something that felt like a trapdoor opening under my chair. I was 34 when my adoptive parents, Lena and Robert Beaumont, died on a rainy Thursday evening outside Portland, Oregon. They had been driving home from dinner with friends when another driver lost control on a slick curve and crossed the center line. One phone call turned my life into before and after. For 2 weeks, I was barely functioning. I handled funeral arrangements, answered relatives, cleaned out flowers after the memorial, and tried to breathe through the shock of losing the 2 people who had raised me. Then came the will reading. I was their adopted daughter, legally and in every way that mattered in daily life. But I was not their only child in the emotional sense. I had been born into a family that was struggling badly when I was a toddler. My biological mother had addiction issues. My biological father was mostly absent, and when social services became involved, the outcome was complicated. I was adopted by Lena and Robert, a couple who had known my maternal aunt through church. My older sister Lena went to live with that aunt. My younger brother Marcus stayed with our grandmother for several years and later moved in with another relative. It was messy, imperfect, and painful, but Lena and Robert never pretended Lena and Marcus did not exist. They did the opposite. They helped with school clothes, dental bills, used cars, college deposits, rent emergencies, and holiday travel. They invited my siblings to birthdays and graduations. My mother, Elaine, kept framed photos of all 3 of us in the hallway, even though only one of us had her last name. My father, Robert, once drove 6 hours to help Marcus move out of a bad apartment. When Lena had her first baby, my parents sent the crib. So when the attorney told me the final will left everything to me, I felt something twist inside me. Not because I wanted less, not because I was ungrateful, but because it did not sound like them. At first, I told myself there might be an explanation. Maybe my parents had decided they had already helped Lena and Marcus enough during their lives. Maybe they had spoken to them privately. Maybe there were tax reasons, business reasons, debts I knew nothing about. Grief makes you suspicious of your own instincts. It also makes every decision feel like a betrayal of someone. After the meeting, I sat in my car in the parking lot for almost 40 minutes. Rain slid down the windshield in thin streams, blurring the office building ahead of me. I had the final will in a folder on the passenger seat. My name appeared over and over again as sole beneficiary. Simone Elaine Beaumont. Their daughter. Their heir. Their whole estate. I should have felt protected. Instead, I felt cornered. Lena called before I even started the engine. She was 41, a nurse in Salem, and the kind of person who always tried to sound calm even when she was scared. She asked how the meeting went. I told her there was another will. She went quiet. I said, "An older one. It included you and Marcus." Still nothing. Then she said, very softly, "And the new one does not." I closed my eyes. "No, it leaves everything to me." There was a long pause, and in that pause I heard every old wound our family had carried. I heard the years when I lived in a stable house with piano lessons and packed lunches while Lena was figuring out how to stretch grocery money at our aunt's house. I heard Marcus pretending he did not care when my parents bought me a car at 16 and helped him only after his own car broke down. I heard the invisible line adoption had drawn through the 3 of us, even though none of us had chosen it. Lena did not accuse me. That almost made it worse. She only said, "That does not sound like Elaine." I whispered, "I know." When I called Marcus later, his reaction was different. He laughed once bitterly and said, "Well, I guess paper wins in the end." I told him, "I do not think this is right." He said, "Right or legal, because those are not always the same thing." That sentence stayed with me all night. I slept badly, if you can call it sleep. I kept seeing my mother's hands writing birthday cards to Lena's children. I kept hearing my father tell Marcus, after Marcus finished trade school, that he was proud of him. Not polite proud, real proud. The kind that made my brother look down because he did not know what to do with it. By morning, I knew I could not simply accept the final will without understanding how it came to exist. I was not ready to accuse anyone of wrongdoing. I was not even ready to say my parents had been manipulated. But I needed facts. The estate attorney from the reading, Mr. Hargrove, had not drafted the final will. He had only been retained to administer the estate after my parents' deaths, because his firm had handled some older family matters. The final will had been drafted by an attorney named Nolan Price, someone I had never heard my parents mention. That alone bothered me. My parents were loyal to professionals. They had used the same accountant for 20 years and the same dentist since I was in middle school. My mother once drove across town for a hairdresser who had moved salons because, as she put it, trust is not disposable. Why would they suddenly go to an unfamiliar lawyer to rewrite their entire estate plan? A friend from work gave me the name of Priscilla Nakamura, a probate attorney known for handling contested estates without turning every family disagreement into a public war. I called her office expecting to leave a message, but her assistant scheduled me for the next afternoon. Priscilla's office was nothing like the dark wood and leather conference room where the will reading had happened. It was bright, neat, and practical, with file boxes stacked beside a printer and a small orchid on the windowsill. Priscilla was in her early 50s, with silver-streaked black hair pulled into a low bun and a way of listening that made me choose my words carefully. I brought copies of everything I had: the final will, the attorney's letter, my parents' death certificates, and the few emails I had been able to find about estate planning. I told her the whole story, including the part that made me feel ashamed, that legally I benefited from the change. When I finished, Priscilla tapped the final will with one finger and said, "The fact that you benefit does not prevent you from asking whether this document reflects their true intent." I asked, "Is it suspicious?" She did not rush. "It is unusual. A dramatic change 2 weeks before an unexpected death is not automatically invalid. People are allowed to change their minds. But we look at capacity, undue influence. Who arranged the meeting, who selected the attorney, who was present, what explanation was given, and whether the change is consistent with long-standing relationships." I said, "They loved Lena and Marcus." Priscilla nodded. "Then we start with the timeline." That became the first thread we pulled. My parents had signed the final will on April 11th. They died on April 25. According to the execution documents, both were present in Nolan Price's office, along with 2 witnesses and a notary. The will was clean, formal, and direct. It revoked all previous wills. It named me as sole beneficiary. It named me personal representative. It contained no explanation for removing Lena and Marcus. The older will, drafted nearly 7 years earlier by a different attorney, was more detailed. It left the house and primary accounts to me, but it created cash distributions for Lena and Marcus and a small education trust for any grandchildren in their lines. It even described them as children of Elaine and Robert's heart, though not by adoption. When Priscilla read that phrase aloud, I had to turn away. That sounded like my mother. Priscilla requested records from Nolan Price's office. She asked for engagement letters, notes, intake forms, emails, and billing entries. She also asked whether anyone had referred my parents to him. While we waited, she told me to gather anything showing my parents' long-standing intentions toward my siblings. Cards, emails, checks, letters, text messages, photographs, and statements from people who had heard them discuss estate plans. I went through my parents' house slowly, room by room. That house had raised me. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon because my mother kept baking spices in a cabinet by the stove. My father's gardening boots were by the back door, mud-dried along the soles. Their calendar still had dentist appointments and book club meetings written in my mother's careful handwriting. In the den, I found a file labeled Family Planning. Inside were old insurance policies, notes about charitable donations, and a photocopy of the earlier will. On a yellow sticky note attached to it, my mother had written, "Make sure all 3 kids are treated with love, not just law." I sat on the carpet and cried so hard I could not read for several minutes. I sent a photo of the note to Priscilla. She replied that it was emotionally significant, though we would need more than one note to challenge a signed will. But it mattered. It showed the old plan had not been casual. Lena found birthday cards from Elaine that said things like, "We are so proud to be part of your life, and always remember you have family here." Marcus found bank records showing my parents had helped him with a down payment on his small auto repair shop, structured as a no-interest loan he had insisted on repaying. He had every receipt. Then Priscilla received Nolan Price's file. The file was thin, too thin, according to her. There were basic intake notes, copies of IDs, the signed will, and a short questionnaire. No detailed memo explaining why Elaine and Robert wanted to remove two people they had provided for in a prior estate plan. No notes about family history beyond my name. No written confirmation that the consequences had been discussed. No correspondence directly from my parents explaining the change. But there was one thing in the file that stood out immediately. The referral source was listed as Grant Ellison. I knew that name, but only barely. Grant was a business associate my father had started working with a few months before the accident. Robert had retired from a long career in commercial equipment sales, but he had never been good at staying retired. He liked projects, he liked numbers, he liked feeling useful. Grant had approached him about investing in and advising a small logistics software venture. My father mentioned him at dinner twice, maybe 3 times. My mother had seemed polite but not excited. I remembered her saying, "Your father has found another spreadsheet to love." At the time, Grant was just one of those names adults mention in passing. After Priscilla pointed to the referral source, he became something else entirely. Priscilla asked, "Did Grant Ellison have any connection to your parents' estate?" I said, "Not that I know of. Any debt? Business agreement? Pending transfer? I do not know." She leaned back. "We need to find out." That was when she recommended a private investigator named Marisol Vance. I had never hired an investigator before, and the idea made me feel like I had stepped into a different life. Marisol was not dramatic. She did not wear dark glasses or make mysterious promises. She was a former fraud examiner with a plain office, a direct manner, and a habit of writing everything down in a black notebook. At our first meeting, Marisol asked what I wanted to know. I said, "I want to know whether my parents chose this freely." She looked at me for a moment and said, "That is the right question." Marisol began with public records, court filings, business registrations, professional complaints, and social connections. She looked at Grant Ellison's companies and Nolan Price's practice. She reviewed the timing of my father's business dealings and the estate changes. Priscilla handled the legal requests. I kept sorting through my parents' records, feeling like every drawer might contain either comfort or another blow. The more we learned, the stranger it became. Grant Ellison had a pattern. He was charming, well-connected, and always hovering near people with assets, especially older business owners or retirees who still wanted to feel relevant. He would bring them into ventures as advisors, investors, or bridge lenders. Then, in several cases, those people would end up using Nolan Price for estate documents, partnership documents, or asset transfers. On paper, that was not illegal. People refer professionals all the time. But Marisol found 3 probate disputes from the previous decade in which families had complained that relatives changed estate documents after being referred to Nolan by Grant or someone in Grant's circle. None had resulted in formal discipline. 2 settled quietly. 1 was dismissed because the challenger ran out of money. In each case, the change simplified assets in a way that benefited an outside business transaction, reduced obligations to certain family members, or placed control in the hands of one person easier to negotiate with. In my parents' case, making me sole beneficiary simplified everything. If Lena and Marcus were included, the estate would have multiple beneficiaries asking questions. If education trusts existed, administration would be more complex. If the old will stood, money that might otherwise remain available during estate settlement would be set aside. But with me alone, Grant would only have to deal with one grieving daughter, who knew almost nothing about the business arrangement. When Marisol explained that, I felt cold. I asked, "Are you saying Grant wanted the estate easier to handle because of my father's business with him?" She said, "I am saying the final will had that effect. Motive is harder. Influence is harder. But effects matter when they line up with timing and referral patterns." Priscilla obtained documents related to my father's business venture with Grant. There was an investment agreement, a consulting arrangement, and a pending buyout clause triggered by death. If my father's estate became tied up or contested among multiple beneficiaries, Grant's company could face delays and scrutiny. If I inherited everything cleanly, he could approach me with a settlement and close the matter quickly. And he did approach me. 3 days after I learned about the referral, Grant called my cell phone. I still do not know how he got the number. though it was probably in my father's records. His voice was warm, polished, almost paternal. He said, "Simone, I am so sorry for your loss. Your father spoke of you often." I thanked him carefully. He said, "I hate to bring up business at a time like this, but there are a few loose ends with Robert's advisory interest. Nothing alarming. In fact, I think I can make it very simple for you." Simple. That word landed hard. He proposed that I sign a release and accept a modest payout for my father's interest in the venture. He framed it as a kindness, a way to spare me months of paperwork. Before my work with Priscilla, I might have considered it. I was exhausted. I wanted fewer documents, fewer calls, fewer reminders that my father was gone. Instead, I said, "Please send everything to my attorney." There was the smallest pause. Then Grant said, "Still pleasant, of course. Who are you using?" "Nolan can probably explain the structure, since he is already familiar with the estate." I said, "I am not using Nolan Price." The warmth in his voice cooled by a degree. "I see." After I hung up, I wrote down every word I could remember and sent it to Priscilla and Marisol. Priscilla's response was brief. "Do not speak with him alone again." The emotional part was harder than the legal part. I was grieving my parents while investigating the possibility that someone had used their trust against them. I was also trying to hold my relationship with Lena and Marcus together before old resentments could harden into new ones. At first, Marcus kept his distance. He answered my calls but rarely called first. When we met at a diner halfway between our homes to talk through what Priscilla was finding, he sat with his arms crossed and barely touched his coffee. He said, "I need you to understand what this looks like from where I am sitting." I said, "I do." He shook his head. "No, Simone, you cannot fully. You got the parents. You got the house. You got the name. Now the will says you get everything else too. And I am supposed to believe you are going to fight that?" It hurt, but he was not wrong to question it. The facts looked ugly. I told him, "I am not fighting because I want to look good. I am fighting because I found Mom's note. Because Dad would have told us if he changed his mind. Because I cannot live in that house knowing something was taken from you and Lena through me." His jaw tightened when I called Elaine and Robert Mom and Dad. I had done it without thinking. They were my parents, but they had also been almost parents to him in a way that had never been legally recognized. After a long silence, Marcus said, "I do not want charity. I am not offering charity." "Then what are you offering?" "The truth first, then whatever honors it." He looked out the window at the wet parking lot and finally said, "Then keep going." Lena was more open, but she carried her own pain. She told me one night that she had always believed Elaine had planned something for her children, not because she needed money from my parents, but because it would have meant they saw her family as permanent. She said, "It is strange what matters after someone dies. It is not only the amount, it is whether they remembered you when they were making their final plans." That sentence became one of the reasons I refused to let the matter disappear into a private discomfort. Priscilla moved carefully. She did not want to file a will contest based on emotion alone. She requested medical records to evaluate capacity. My parents had been in their late 60s, healthy enough to travel, drive, and manage daily life. There was no dementia diagnosis, no obvious incapacity. That meant our strongest argument would not be that they were unable to understand the will. It would be undue influence or suspicious circumstances surrounding procurement of the document. In probate law, Priscilla explained, undue influence is rarely proven by someone admitting I pressured them. It is built from context, a confidential relationship, a sudden change, isolation or dependency, an unnatural disposition, participation by someone who benefits directly or indirectly, a weakened state if present, a lack of independent advice. My parents were not helpless. That made the case harder. But they were grieving in their own way before they died, because my father's closest friend had passed away that winter. My father had also been anxious about proving the new business venture was not a foolish late-life decision. Grant had positioned himself as a helpful younger associate who admired him. That mattered. Marisol interviewed people around the edges of Grant's world. A former office manager from one of his dissolved companies agreed to speak off the record at first, then later allowed a summary of her statements. She said Grant often talked about reducing friction in personal estates when older partners were involved. He believed heirs complicated business. He liked documents that created a single decision maker. She remembered Nolan Price's name because Grant had joked that Nolan knew how to keep families from turning every deal into Thanksgiving dinner. It was not a smoking gun, but it fit the picture. Marisol also found calendar entries from my father's email account. On March 28th, Grant had lunch with my father. On March 30, my father and mother had a meeting labeled GE Documents. On April 3, there was an appointment with Nolan Price. On April 11th, the final will was signed. Nowhere in the emails did my parents discuss wanting to remove Lena and Marcus. Nowhere did they mention a family meeting or moral concern or changed relationship. What did appear was a short email from Grant to my father after the March 28th lunch. Nolan is excellent for streamlining estate issues tied to business interests. He will make sure Simone is not buried in administrative headaches. When I read that line, my stomach turned. Make sure Simone is not buried in administrative headaches. It sounded helpful. It also sounded like the entire purpose was to make me the only person anyone had to deal with. Priscilla sent Nolan Price a formal letter raising concerns about the final will's execution and requesting clarification. His reply was defensive but polished. He said Elaine and Robert had appeared competent, had stated they wanted to simplify their estate and had signed voluntarily. He denied any improper influence. He insisted Grant Ellison was merely a referral source and was not present when the will was executed. Priscilla noticed what he did not say. He did not provide detailed notes of why my parents wanted to exclude Lena and Marcus. He did not say he had reviewed the prior will with them line by line. He did not say he advised them to consider discussing the change with the affected people. He did not explain why a couple with an existing estate attorney suddenly used him days after a business associate referred them. We requested a meeting with Nolan through Priscilla. I did not attend alone. Priscilla sat beside me, her yellow legal pad open, while Nolan appeared by video from his office. He was younger than I expected, maybe early 40s, with a careful smile and a bookshelf arranged too neatly behind him. Priscilla asked him, "What explanation did Mr. and Mrs. Beaumont give for removing Lena Ortiz and Marcus Reed from their estate plan?" Nolan said, "They wanted simplicity." Priscilla asked, "Did they express any concern about those individuals? Estrangement? Prior gifts? Financial independence?" He shifted. "I do not recall specific phrasing. Are there notes?" "My notes reflect the final instruction. Did you review the earlier will?" "I was aware there was a prior plan." Priscilla waited. "That was not my question," he said. "I do not believe I had a full copy at the first meeting. At the signing?" Another pause. "I would have to check." Priscilla's voice stayed even. "Mr. Price, you drafted a document that removed 2 named beneficiaries from a long-standing estate plan 2 weeks before the testators died unexpectedly. Your file contains no substantive explanation for the change. The referral came from a business associate whose pending transaction benefited from simplified estate administration. Do you understand why that raises concern?" Nolan's smile disappeared. "I reject the implication." "You may reject it. You still need to answer the question." He gave no satisfying answer. He kept returning to competence and signatures. Competence and signatures mattered, but they were not the whole truth. After that meeting, Priscilla recommended filing a will contest. She warned me it would not be easy. It could be expensive. It could make private family pain part of a court record. It could strain my relationships with Lena and Marcus in new ways. And because I was the named beneficiary under the final will, my role was unusual. I was not trying to take more. I was challenging a document that benefited me. I asked her whether a judge would think I was being dramatic. Priscilla said, "A judge will look at evidence. We have enough to ask the court to look too." Before filing, I invited Lena and Marcus to my parents' house. It was the first time all 3 of us had been there together since the memorial. The house felt too quiet, as if it was waiting for my mother to call from the kitchen. We sat at the dining room table where Elaine used to insist on real napkins for holiday meals. I put the older will, the final will, my mother's sticky note, Grant's email, and Priscilla's summary on the table. I said, "I want to contest the final will, not because I know exactly what happened in that office, but because I do not believe this document reflects who they were. If we win, the court may restore the prior will or push everyone toward settlement. If we lose, the final will stands. Either way, I want you both to know I am not hiding behind it." Lena reached for the sticky note and touched the edge of it like it was fragile cloth. Marcus read Grant's email twice. Then he said, "This guy really thought you would just sign whatever he sent. I think he hoped I would." Marcus looked at me, and for the first time since the will reading, his expression softened. "Then let us make that a bad bet." The filing changed the tone of everything. Grant stopped calling me directly. Nolan Price hired counsel. The estate administration slowed. Documents had to be preserved. Priscilla filed pleadings describing suspicious circumstances, the prior will, the sudden change, the business referral, the thin drafting file, the lack of documented explanation, and the financial effect on Grant's pending transaction. There is something surreal about seeing your family's pain converted into numbered paragraphs. Paragraph 12. Decedents maintained a long-standing supportive relationship with Lena Ortiz and Marcus Reed. Paragraph 19. The final will was executed approximately 2 weeks before the fatal accident. Paragraph 24. The attorney who drafted the final will was recommended by Grant Ellison. Paragraph 31. The final will materially simplified estate administration in a manner beneficial to pending business negotiations. Legal language is dry, but underneath it was my mother's sticky note, my brother's bitterness, my sister's quiet hurt, and my father's trust in the wrong man. Discovery brought more details. Nolan's billing records showed a call with Grant's office before the first meeting with my parents. Nolan's counsel argued it was only scheduling. Priscilla asked why Grant's office was scheduling personal estate planning for people who were not his relatives. There was no good answer. One witness from Nolan's office remembered Grant dropping off a folder for the Beaumont matter. She could not say what was inside. Nolan claimed it contained business documents relevant to the estate. Priscilla argued that this showed Grant was more involved than a neutral referral source. The witnesses to the will signing said my parents seemed alert. That was not surprising. No one claimed they were confused. But one witness also recalled my mother asking whether this would affect the kids, and Nolan responding that the new structure would avoid complications. The witness did not remember exactly what my mother said next, only that my father told her. This is what Grant said would keep things clean for Simone. When Priscilla read that testimony to me, I felt grief and anger collide. My parents had not said, "We no longer want to provide for Lena and Marcus." They had said, "We want to keep things clean for Simone." That was the lever. Someone had taken my parents' love for me and used it to justify removing the others. I thought about all the times my mother had worried about burdening me. When I was in college, she apologized for asking me to drive her home after a minor procedure because she did not want to interrupt my exam week. When my father needed help after knee surgery, he kept saying, "Do not let this take over your life." They were exactly the kind of people who could be persuaded that a simplified will was a gift to me, especially if the consequences were softened or rushed. That realization broke something open in me. Until then, part of me had feared that maybe they really had changed their minds about Lena and Marcus. Maybe I had romanticized them. Maybe the old will was the past and the new will was the truth. But the testimony made a different truth visible. They had likely been guided toward a result they did not fully understand, under the language of protecting me. Settlement talks began after that deposition. Nolan Price did not admit wrongdoing. Grant Ellison did not admit influence. Their attorneys used phrases like litigation risk and disputed facts and cost of continued proceedings. Priscilla told us not to expect an apology. In civil matters, accountability often comes disguised as money and revised terms. The proposed settlement restored meaningful provisions for Lena and Marcus from the estate, based closely on the earlier will. It created education funds for Lena's 2 children and Marcus's son. It allowed me to keep the house, which had always been intended for me, but required a fair distribution of investment assets. It also required Grant's company to buy out my father's interest at a value reviewed by an independent appraiser, not the low number Grant had first offered me over the phone. When Priscilla explained the terms, I looked at Lena and Marcus before I answered. We were in her conference room, the same place where I had first asked whether the final will was suspicious. Lena had tears in her eyes. Marcus kept his gaze on the table, but his shoulders had dropped, like he had been carrying something heavy for years and had finally set part of it down. I asked, "Does this feel right enough?" Lena said, "It feels like they remembered us." Marcus nodded. "It feels like someone had to answer for trying to erase us." So we accepted. The court approved the settlement several weeks later. The final will was not thrown out in a dramatic trial, but its harshest effect was undone. The estate was administered under the settlement terms. Lena received enough to pay off debt and start college accounts for her children. Marcus used part of his distribution to expand his repair shop and replace equipment he had been nursing along for years. I kept my parents' house, though it took me months before I could sleep there without waking up at every creak. Grant's business dealings with my father's estate ended under independent valuation. He did not get the quick, quiet release he had wanted. Nolan Price remained careful, defensive, and professionally untouched in the formal sense, but Priscilla filed appropriate complaints and documentation with the relevant professional channels. Whether anything came of that, I do not know. I learned that the law can correct some damage without fully naming every wrong. Marisol closed her investigation with a final report and a conversation I still think about. We met at a small coffee shop near her office. She slid a folder across the table and said, "People think undue influence always looks like threats. Sometimes it looks like convenience. Sometimes it sounds like, 'Let me make this easier for your daughter.'" I asked her if she believed my parents knew they were cutting out Lena and Marcus. Marisol looked out the window for a moment before answering. "I believe they signed the document. I also believe the evidence suggests they were steered toward a result that served someone else's priorities. Those two things can both be true." That was not the clean answer I wanted, but it was probably the honest one. In the months that followed, my relationship with Lena and Marcus changed. Not magically, not perfectly. There were still old aches between us. I could not undo the fact that I had been adopted into comfort, while they had grown up with more instability. I could not give them back the childhood we should have shared under one roof. But we stopped pretending those differences were too dangerous to discuss. Lena began coming over on Sundays with her kids. At first, the visits were awkward because my parents' house carried so much history. Her daughter asked why Grandma Elaine had so many pictures of Aunt Simone and not as many of them. Lena froze, but I answered honestly. I said, "Because I lived here, and Grandma Elaine saw me every day. But she loved all of you, and we are going to put up more pictures now." So we did. We added photos of Lena's children at the beach, Marcus's son holding a baseball trophy, the three of us at the courthouse after the settlement approval, tired but together. The hallway changed. It became less like a record of who had belonged legally and more like a record of who had mattered. Marcus came by one Saturday to help fix the garage door opener. My father would have loved that, because he believed every problem could be solved with either a spreadsheet or a socket wrench. Marcus found an old toolbox with Robert's initials scratched into the handle. He stood there holding it for a long time. Then he said, "He taught me how to change brake pads in this garage." "I remember," I said. I acted like I already knew. I smiled. "You always acted like you already knew." He laughed, and for a second we were not heirs or claimants or evidence in a probate dispute. We were just siblings standing in a garage full of dust and memory. Later, Marcus asked if he could keep one of my father's old socket sets. I told him he could take the whole toolbox. He refused at first, then accepted the smaller set. That was Marcus. Even after everything, he needed to feel he was not taking too much. The money mattered. I will not pretend it did not. It changed real things for Lena and Marcus. But the deeper outcome was that the final document did not get to become the final story. That mattered more than I expected. For a while, I was angry at my parents too. That may sound unfair, but grief is not fair. I was angry they had trusted Grant. Angry they had not called me before changing the will. Angry they had been so concerned about making things easy for me that they did not see how easy they were making it for someone else. Then I would find one of my mother's notes, or hear one of my father's old voicemails, and anger would collapse into missing them. Eventually, I stopped trying to force one feeling to win. I loved them. I missed them. I believed they made a serious mistake. I also believed that mistake was shaped by someone else's influence. All of that could fit inside the truth. Priscilla once told me estate disputes are rarely only about property. They are about what the dead seem to say with their last documents, and what the living are left to do with that message. In our case, the final will said I was the only one who counted. The evidence said something different. My parents' years of support said something different. The older will said something different. My mother's sticky note said something different in 6 simple words. All 3 kids treated with love. That note is framed now in the small room I use as an office. Not because it is legally powerful anymore. The case is over. The estate is closed. I keep it because it reminds me how close we came to letting a suspicious document rewrite a family. I have also learned to be less polite with discomfort. Before this happened, I might have avoided asking hard questions because I did not want to seem accusatory. I might have told myself that professionals knew best, that signed papers were beyond challenge, that suspicion was unkind. Now I know better. Respect for someone's wishes does not mean blindly accepting the last paper placed in front of you. Sometimes honoring the dead means asking whether that paper truly reflected them. If there is one thing I wish my parents had done differently, it would be to talk openly with all 3 of us. Not just about money, but about intention. Secrets create space for other people to step in. Silence makes manipulation easier. A clear conversation may feel uncomfortable while everyone is alive, but it can prevent years of doubt after they are gone. Lena, Marcus, and I still gather every April around the anniversary of the accident. The first year, we went to the cemetery separately. The second year, we went together. Lena brought flowers. Marcus brought a small toy car from his son, because Robert had loved old cars. I brought a copy of a photograph showing Elaine and Robert at Lena's wedding, standing behind her with their hands on her shoulders. Not adoptive parents in the legal record, not biological parents, but family, in the complicated, stubborn way family sometimes exist beyond forms. Standing there, Marcus said, "I think they would be embarrassed this happened." Lena said, "I think they would be grateful." Simone did not let it stand. I did not know what to say, so I just placed the photograph beside the flowers. The truth is, I did not do anything heroic. I asked questions because the answer I was given did not match the people I knew. I had help from a careful attorney, a determined investigator, and 2 siblings who were willing to trust me even when history gave them reasons not to. The final outcome did not bring my parents back. It did not erase every hurt. But it restored something important: the recognition that Lena and Marcus had not been outsiders to my parents' love. And for me, that was the real inheritance worth protecting. If you were in my place, named as the only beneficiary under a will that benefited you but hurt people you knew your parents loved, would you have questioned it? Or would you have accepted the document as final? I would really like to know what you think, because situations like this are never as simple as they look from the outside. Share your thoughts, and if this story reminded you of a family secret, a disputed will, or a moment when doing the legal thing and doing the right thing did not feel the same, tell us about it. Thank you for listening to my story. Subscribe for more true-to-life family stories about inheritance, betrayal, hidden documents, and the hard choices people make when love and money collide. Take care, and I hope you leave with a little more courage to ask the difficult questions.